In Sydney's CBD, there stands an obelisk, and if you weren't actually looking for it, you would probably not pay much attention, let alone know the purpose for which it was erected. On one of its faces is written, "This marks the site of the first church erected in Australia, opened August 25th, 1793. Reverend Richard Johnson, B.A., chaplain, being the first minister." So then, this naturally raises questions. What was establishing the first church in Australia actually like? Who was Richard Johnson? What were his initial thoughts concerning the First Nations peoples? And is there anything that Christians today can learn from his experience? In this episode, we will explore these and more, diving into some of Johnson's own writings to view from his perspective what early Christian witness to the early settlers and indigenous inhabitants look like. We travel back to the late 1700s. Back in England, plans are set for the first fleet to transport the convicts and establish a settlement in Sydney. In addition to the government's directives, several individuals propose the sending of a minister for the sake of the fleet's crews and convicts' spiritual well-being, and for the establishing of a church. They are part of a group named the Eclectic Society, comprised of evangelicals with interest in prison reform and missions. Some of the more prominent members include the philanthropist Henry Thornton, the ex-slave trader and composer of Amazing Grace John Newton, and the abolitionist William Wilberforce. And they put forward Richard Johnson as their preferred candidate. Johnson, once a farmer and a teacher, then a Church of England clergyman, having graduated first from Cambridge, then being ordained as the Bishop of Oxford in 1784, appears to have had promising life of ministry in England ahead of him before this nomination was put forward. The gravity of forsaking such a life is felt where he writes, "For several nights and days, both my sleep and appetite were in a great measure taken away. I did little else than weep and sigh, whilst I trust both by fervent prayer and fasting. I implored divine direction what to do in an affair of so weighty moment. On the one hand, the idea of leaving my parents, relations, friends, and the respectful connections which I had formed, the dangers of the sea, the descriptions of people I was going with, the place to which we were going, to the very ends of the earth, to a country wild and uncultivated, to be exposed to savages, and perhaps to various wild beasts of prey. These and such like ideas so impressed my mind with fear and terror that I sometimes was greatly inclined and almost resolved to decline the offer. But then, on the other hand, when I considered the hopes and prospects of being rendered useful in the reformation of those poor and abandoned people, the power and promises of God to protect me in any place or situation wherein, in the line of duty, I followed the leading of Providence, and the prospects of a glorious reward hereafter, laid up in heaven for all God's faithful servants and people. These considerations overbalanced and removed all my scruples and fears, and induced me to give my free consent to enter upon this hazardous expedition." Thus, accepting his appointment as chaplain to the settlement via royal warrant, Johnson prepared to embark. This included, among other particulars, such as marrying a certain Mary Burton, about half a Baptist and half a Methodist, as Johnson once quipped, who was also willing to accept such a challenging mission, a visit to the fleet's convict hulks, as enabled by Thornton, and an introduction to the societies for the propagation of the gospel and for promoting Christian knowledge, thanks to Wilberforce. Newton penned the following poem as way of encouragement to Johnson. "The Lord who sends thee hence will be thine aid. In vain at thee the lion, danger, roars. His arm and love shall keep thee undismayed on tempest-tossed seas and savage shores. Go, bear the Saviour's name to lands unknown. Tell to the southern world his wondrous grace. An energy divine thy words shall own, and draw their untaught hearts to seek his face. Many in quest of gold or empty fame would compass earth or venture near the poles, but how much nobler thy reward and aim, to spread his praise and win immortal souls. Johnson himself wrote regularly, and so we learn of the tempest-tossed seas and difficult personalities he deals with on the voyage early on. More specifically, of the early opportunities for ministry en route, we read, "We have prayer every evening in the great cabin. He, the captain, has granted me leave also to preach once at least on a Lord's Day to the ship's crew. Accordingly, last Sunday I preached to them. My text was in Matthew chapter 5 verse 34, designed to set forth the heinous evil of common swearing. Satisfied and pleased with my subject, hoped that I should repeat or follow this practice throughout the voyage. Since then I have scarcely heard an oath from any of them. May God convince them of the folly and wickedness of such a conduct." This initial approach that seemed to target certain unwanted behaviour was probably the product of being directed by Australia's first governor, Arthur Phillip, whose chief concern was for civility and order, to begin with moral subjects. Upon finally arriving in Botany Bay, one of the first things Johnson reports is his first, and we will note positive, encounter with a local indigenous tribe. He writes, "The first I saw were all walking up the beach, which they did with some degree of surprise and consternation. A few days after, I saw 30 of them fishing. As we came near them, they spoke to us in a loud, dissonant manner. Warra, warra, why? Which we judged to be to tell us to go away. When we came up to them, I tied some bits of cloth, etc., around their heads and necks, and also gave one of them a comb, at which he seemed especially pleased and astonished. Some of them then began to dance, and one of them offered me one of his fishing gigs, which I refused, the governor ordering that nothing should be taken from them." As to the first church service on Australian soil itself, as the Obelisk records, this occurred on the 3rd of February, 1788, a week after the First Fleet's landing at Sydney Cove. Convicts were ordered to attend the service and to appear as clean as circumstances will admit, and no man to be absent on any account whatever. Moreover, the changeover for the guard watch was arranged to occur earlier in order to provide them time to cleanse themselves before church. And so, at 10 a.m. that day, the beating of the church drum was heard, and under the shade of some trees, the first church service commenced. On another face of the obelisk, situated where those trees once stood, a quote from that first sermon Johnson preached there is featured, taken from Psalm 116, verse 12. "What shall I render unto the Lord for all his benefits toward me?" By 18th century standards, the First Fleet's voyage was considered highly successful, losing not more than 30 of the approximate 1,400 lives that journeyed the roughly 24,000 kilometres over 8 months from England to the eastern coast of Australia. The chosen text, therefore, would be a most appropriate portion of scripture from which to base his message. The opportunities that would be afforded the convicts in this new South land, moreover, makes this psalm all the more fitting. Unfortunately, we do not possess any surviving copy of Johnson's complete sermon, nor any of the others that would follow. But, given his evangelical commitments, and based on the writings we do have, it would be likely some appeal for the saving of any as yet unredeemed souls was also made, perhaps connecting the very next verse, "I will take up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord," with the fuller biblical witness to the ultimate salvation Jesus provides. Importantly, it should be further noted that the first communion was celebrated 2 weeks later, February 17, this time with the aid of Lieutenant Ralph Clark's marquee. Clark records in his journal of this occasion, "I will keep this table also as long as I live, for it is the first table that ever the Lord's Supper was eat of in this country." While a seemingly positive start, Johnson's letters reveal that he was no stranger to the difficulties that the fledgling colony faced, and, indeed, as the sole minister, he shared in the burden of so many others. In a letter dated November 15th, 1788, for example, he speaks of the makeshift accommodation, his little cabbage tree cottage, though thankful for it, that how, now and then, in excessive rains, we are all in a swim within doors, and that, while his, quote, little garden also begins to flourish and supplies us daily with either one kind of vegetable or another. The country in general, I confess, I have no very great opinion of, nor expectation from it. The greatest part of it is poor and barren and rocky, and requires a great deal of labour to clear it of trees, roots, etc., and to cultivate it. And after all, the corn that has been sown hitherto looks very poor and unpromising. I have been at work in my little farm for a day together, burning wood, digging, sowing, etc., but do not expect to reap anything nearly adequate to my labour. Others seem to be in the same predicament, and all almost, at least with but few exceptions, are heartily sick of the expedition, and wish themselves back safe in old England. I hope I have said enough to dissuade you from ever emigrating to this part of the world. I should be most heartily glad again to see you on that side of southern and Atlantic seas, except the pity and concern I feel for these poor people with whom I am here connected. Happy would I be were I to live upon bread and water, did I but see some of these poor souls begin to think about their latter end. Am sorry to see so little good yet done amongst them. They neither see, nor will be persuaded to seek the Lord of mercy and compassion of God. They prefer their lust before their souls. Yea, most of them will sell their souls for a glass of grog. So blind, so foolish, so hardened are they. So then, like the first estimations of the unpromising fertility of the Australian soil, Johnson, himself once a farmer in England, was somewhat discouraged in the seeming lack of fruitfulness in his ministry to the new settlers. Certainly, Johnson had too great a responsibility for overseeing the entire colony, spreading him thin. He continues, "The colony begins already to be a good deal dispersed. Understand that I am sometimes to go thither to perform divine services. The distance is 12 or 14 miles by water, which will make it very inconvenient and unpleasant." Adding to the strain was the death of a newborn son, and Nellie losing Mary in the ordeal. And one also notices the further discouragement in his mention of the settlement's priorities. "I am yet obliged to be a field preacher. No church is yet begun of, and I am afraid scarcely thought of. Other things seem to be of greater notice and concern, and most would rather see a tavern, a playhouse, a brothel, anything sooner than a place for public worship." Nevertheless, we learn that Johnson's prior prayerful acceptance of his post produced in him a will to persevere, writing, "Most have wrote to request they might be called home. This, however, I have not yet done, and purpose to give it a little further trial." In a letter dated April 9th, 1790, and while in the face of dwindling provisions and speculation that the next shipment of supplies may have been lost at sea, he yet expresses his thankfulness that, quote, "As an individual, I am as well off as most, have plenty of vegetables, potatoes, etc., which I feel of essential service, and which are chiefly the fruits of my own hard labour. As to my family, we are in a thriving way. Mrs. Johnson has had a second child. The first was a boy, but stillborn. The latter is a girl, a sweet babe about 5 weeks old. Have baptized her already." He continues, revealing his close contact with the local indigenous population, saying of his own new daughter, "Have given it the name of Milba Maria." Milba, a name amongst the natives. "Have a native girl under my care. I've had her now about 11 months. She was brought in here together with 3 others dreadfully afflicted with the smallpox. The 2 men died. Abaru, the name of the girl, and a boy, Nanberry, recovered. The latter is with the Surgeon General. Have taken some pains with Abaru, about 15 years old, to instruct her in reading, and have no reason to complain of her improvement. She can likewise begin to speak a little English, and is useful in several things about our little hut. Have taught her the Lord's Prayer, etc. And as she comes better to understand men, endeavour to instruct her respecting a supreme being, etc. Wish to see these poor heathen brought to the knowledge of Christianity, and hope in time when these shall be given for our Lord's heritage, and the uttermost parts of the earth for his possession. Adding, in contrast to the response of these indigenous individuals, the thus far disappointing results of fruit among the convicts, though ensuring the recipient of his letter understands he has not given up hope for them altogether. Further to Johnson's care of the sick, such as those indigenous persons suffering from smallpox, we see God's love expressed also through Johnson's response upon the arrival of the Second Fleet in 1790. His response to the survivors of what can only be seen as shocking negligence and gross mistreatment of the convicts it had transported, owing in part to the greed of the private charters. The numbers of dead and sick in this table is telling. Johnson writes, "Have been on board these different ships. Was first on board the Surprise. Went down amongst the convicts, a great number of them laying, some half and others nearly quite naked, without either bed or bedding, unable to turn or help themselves. Spoke to them as I passed along, but the smell was so offensive that I could scarcely bear it. Some of these unhappy people died after the ships came into the harbour, before they could be taken on shore. Part of these had been thrown into the harbour, and their dead bodies cast upon the shore. Took the occasion to represent this to His Excellency, in consequence of which immediate orders were sent on board that those who died on board should be carried to the opposite north shore and be buried. The landing of these people was truly affecting and shocking. Great numbers were not able to walk, nor to move hand or foot. Upon their being brought up to the open air, some fainted, some died upon deck, and others in the boat before they reached the shore. The hospital erected here is not sufficient. It was fortunate that a new hospital was brought out in the Justinian. The usage they met with on board, according to their own story, was truly shocking. Sometimes for days, nay, for a considerable time together, they have been to the middle in water chained together, hand and leg, even the sick not exempted. Nay, many died with the chains upon them. Promises, entreaties were all in vain, and it was not till a very few days before they made the harbour that they were released out of irons. Endeavoured to commiserate them under their afflictions, pitied them, encouraged them to hope many of them would soon recover, that every indulgence, every attention would be paid to them, prayed with them, and gave some books amongst those of them that were able to read." One individual writing home to England in this year remarked, "Few of the sick would recover if it was not for the kindness of the Reverend Mr. Johnson, whose assistance out of his own stores makes him the physician both of soul and body." Continuing to work through Johnson's writings chronologically, we note a further trial faced in the following year. Johnson writes in March the 18th, 1791, "Again things have appeared dark and gloomy. We have been visited with a most severe drought for 9 or 10 months. However, he continues, discussing the potential spiritual implications, then hinting at some missional progress. Justly does God thus in his judgments assist us. We are truly a wicked people. Sin abounds of all kinds, and amongst all ranks, too much. God and religion set little store by. Hope the Lord has hitherto enabled me to be faithful, but confess I at times am ready to sink under my many and great discouragements. I have great need of faith and patience, and am convinced at times that I have not so much as at other times I have been ready to imagine." We are now upon a pretty friendly intercourse with the natives. Numbers of them are coming into the camp daily. This intercourse was principally brought about by means of a little girl, which, if I mistake not, I mentioned to you in a former letter. For some time this girl made good improvement in her behaviour, and we began to be very partial to her. But since they have come in common, she has not behaved so well or so complying. Once and again she has been off in the woods for some time, but believes she finds things better in camp and with us than amongst her countrymen. Hope that good will come out of all of this, though appearances are yet very dark. Have wrote home to some of our great ones, and I hope good ones too, upon the propriety of sending out missionaries. If it was not already so apparent, Johnson's evangelical commitment to the furtherance of the gospel is clearly evident in a letter dated October the 4th, 1791. I am not ashamed of the precious gospel of Jesus, have long since come to the apostles' resolution, 1 Corinthians 2:2, well knowing that whatever doctrine does not tend to humble the sinner and to exalt the Saviour is Antichrist. I may probably have expressed in my letters to you and others that I am sick of my situation. But, after all, I assure you, I have no immediate intentions of returning to Europe. I am persuaded that I am where God aims and intends me to be. Until I see my way home more clearly than I do at present, I think it my duty to abide where I am. I hope and trust I have not laboured wholly in vain, and I trust in time, in spite of all opposition and obstacles, God will make bare his holy arm in the conversion and salvation of the souls of men. Our colony begins to increase greatly. Last Sunday I preached, I suppose, to not less than 600 or 800, and I have since heard that one, at least, went away sorrowful and heavy-hearted, and some others rejoicing in the Son of God manifested toward them. I see it necessary, and find it precious work, at times, I trust, to speak of the great and inestimable love of Jesus in dying for sinners, and inviting them to come to him, to believe and to rest upon him for life and salvation. No church is yet built or even begun of, and the only place that we can procure for the purpose of public worship is an old storehouse or barrack, etc. I have frequent promises and assurances made me, however, that in a little time a church shall be built, both here at Sydney and at Parramatta or Rose Hill. Rose Hill lies at the head of this harbour, distant from this cove, about 12 or 14 miles. At first, I used to go up, perform public duty, and return on the same day. This I found more than I could well go through, and after some time obtained a room. A miserable one it is indeed, but trust I have at times found it a spiritual Bethel, where I sleep on the Saturday and Sunday evening, which gives me an opportunity of visiting the convicts in their huts. And I declare to you that I have found more pleasure at times in doing this than in preaching, etc. Another clergyman came out in the Gorgon, who is chaplain to the New South Wales Corps. His name is Bain, who informs me that he saw you at Portsmouth. He has preached on shore 2 Sundays, but I have never heard him, being elsewhere employed at the same time. I wish rather than hope that he may prove a fellow labourer in the same blessed cause. I have need of wisdom, and I hope my good friends will not cease daily to pray for me. And yet, despite such earnest efforts, times of apparent fruitfulness and additional labourers, Johnson, again, does not shy from continuing to share his disappointments, as a letter dated February the 29th, 1792 reveals. I have often lamented, and not seldom complained, of the thinness of the congregation, sometimes not 1/2, 1/3, and sometimes 1/4 of the convicts, especially the women, present. Many of the officers, both civil and military, and I may add, of the naval and merchant line too, have frequently apologised for their non-attendance, and have assigned as the cause the want of a convenient place of worship. We have been here now above 4 years, and the first time we had public service for myself and for the congregation than I did last Sunday, for then we had the advantage of the trees to shelter us from the sun, but now we were wholly exposed to the weather, first to the rain, which I was fearful would have made me dismiss the people, and afterwards to the wind and sun. On this account, sir, it cannot be wondered at that persons come so seldom and so reluctantly to public worship. I submit it to your Excellency's own consideration, whether before the approaching winter some place should not be thought of and built, both here and at the new settlement, for the purpose of carrying on public worship. A letter dated the 23rd of March, 1792, shows once again where the government's priorities lay. Last spring, there was the foundation of a church laid at Parramatta. Before it was finished, it was converted into a jail, or a lock-up house, and now it is converted into a granary. Have had this place to perform divine service in for several Sundays, but now am again turned out, and must again turn field preacher there also. I go up to Parramatta, as usual, once a fortnight, the distance by water about 14 miles. Generally go up on a Saturday, sometimes 4, 5, 6 hours upon the water. On Sunday morning early, I now ride up to the new settlement, preach in the open air about 7 o'clock to about 600 convicts. At 10 and 4 in the afternoon, I preach at Parramatta. I fear, however, I shall not be able to continue this much longer, especially as the winter is now approaching, unless some place be erected for the purpose. Besides my public duty, I have to visit the sick, which, at present, both at Sydney and Parramatta, are a great many numbers dying every day. Last month about 60 died, and I fear before this expires, there will again be near the same number. The strain of these conditions on Johnson shows where he confesses, "I am pretty well aware I cannot stand it many years longer, as things are at present conducted." So frustrated was Johnson at the delay of a church being built, he decided to build one himself, large enough to shelter 500 persons. And significantly, it is in this same year that the first schoolhouse was established by the Reverend, the beginning of Christian schooling in Australia, as remembered at the same site to this day in Sydney. Johnson will later state in a list of rules and articles for the school. 11. The children to be catechised, and to sing one of Dr. Watt's hymns for children every Saturday forenoon, and to be catechised at church at such times as Mr. Johnson or the clergyman officiating may find convenient. 12. A form of prayer to be read by one of the schoolmasters, and one of Dr. Watt's hymns to be sung morning and evening. And it is strongly recommended that parents will send their children early to school to pray, as they are able, for a blessing to attend the instruction given them. 13. The church bell to ring 9:15 in the morning, as a warning for the children to prepare immediately to school. In one season, not only did Johnson experience a passive lack of support building-wise, but, in the now absence of a governor, an active opposition. He records, in a letter dated April the 8th, 1794, "Major Gross is pleased to represent me as a discontented and troublesome character. One morning, as I was going through the service, I was interrupted first by the improper conduct of 2 soldiers, and soon after by the beat of a drum, when instantly the corps took their arms, got into their ranks, and marched away. I had then been barely 3/4 of an hour on the whole service, and was then about the middle of my discourse." Sometime later, in the August of 1797, he writes of the situation having at least some relief, remarking, "Since the arrival of Governor Hunter, which is near 2 years, my situation has been much more comfortable than for some time before. His Excellency sets a becoming example in regularly attending public worship, and wishes as much as he can to promote and establish the principles of morality and religion. But I am sorry to add, few seem to be influenced by his example. Our congregations, however, are much larger than before his arrival, and bad as things yet are, I still hope that out of all this confusion, God will bring some order. I've just now been up with the governor, found him alone and reading a sermon. He showed me the book, and believed the subjects were very important. I only mention this to show you that His Excellency is disposed to promote virtue and morality in the colony." Nevertheless, challenges continued with both lawbreakers and law enforcement. Concerning the former, Johnson recounts, "By far, the major part of the inhabitants are lost to all sense of virtue, and abandoned to every species of wickedness. Seldom a night passed, but in morning some fresh depredations were heard of. Neither have I escaped these nightly visitors. Twice has my house been broken open, once through the wall, brick and half thick, and once through the tiling, and both times I was robbed of property to a considerable amount. As to the latter, quote, once there were 2 men sentenced to suffer death. The same afternoon I visited them in their lonely cells, and intended to visit them again in the evening. The sergeant of the guard called at my house the same evening with a request from the prisoners that I would spare them a candle. I sent one by my servant, and desired him to inform the sergeant that I would come to the prisoners in a few minutes. In less than half an hour, the sergeant came to my house a second time, brought back part of the candle, and informed me that he had received orders not to admit any person to see or speak to the prisoners, except Mr. Bain, chaplain to the corpse. This message surprised me not a little. The Reverend Mr. Marsden was then arrived in the colony, and was with me in the room at the time, and was under no less surprise than myself. We then agreed to go to the guardhouse together. We called for the sergeant, begged he would repeat the message which he had before delivered at my house, which he did nearly in the same words. I replied, "I suppose, Sergeant, you know who we are," and asked if we could not be permitted to see and speak to the two men who were to suffer. I will give your Excellency another instance. A convict and his wife came one morning to my church, and on their return home they met one of the constables, who asked them why they had not been to church. They said they had been there. "Where?" "To hear Mr. Johnson." The constable replied, "Don't you know you are forbidden to go there?" He then threatened to have them punished if they did the like again. It is in this same letter and another that we also see Johnson's health in further decline. And yet he perseveres for another 2 years. In August of 1800, Johnson becomes the treasurer of a committee created by the then Governor Philip Gidley King to supervise the growing number of schools and to conduct an institution for orphans. But only 2 months later, with the persistence of his ailing health, he and his family set sail from Sydney to return home to England. The king would twice request for Johnson to be sent back or replaced. Johnson, apparently, was not opposed to this, but ill health proved too burdensome, and he eventually indicated his inability to accept the position in the March of 1802. The Reverend Richard Johnson made his last recognised contribution to Australia through his giving of evidence to the House of Commons in 1812 concerning the matter of the transportation of convicts. He died the 13th of March, 1827. It perhaps goes without saying that Johnson's role in establishing the first Christian church in Australia was no less than a critical one. Of course, we are not only speaking of the long, arduous trial of his literally building a physical structure within which to hold services and facilitate Christian schooling, but also his tireless labouring among the first settlers and indigenous people to be part of building a spiritual structure, praying, preaching, visiting and caring for the sick and imprisoned, all in addition to the already great challenge of the settlement's attempts to become self-sufficient and not have to rely on the precarious and very infrequent supply drops from Britain. Johnson's writings reveal a sincere Christian faith and earnestness for the gospel of Christ's kingdom to bear fruit. The casual tone and somewhat almost offhandedness in much of his reporting indicates a humility and faith in the one who would ultimately prevail for the great work of establishing and propagating Christianity across the Great South Land. It's difficult to read of his account and not be inspired to likewise persevere in evangelistic efforts in the, in many ways, ongoing, challenging spiritual climate that is Australia today.